Today's story is from the Hitopadesha. It features a vulture, a cat, and a daycare for little birds that pays a very heavy price for not investing enough in the interview process. Welcome to Stories from India. This is a podcast that will take you on a journey through the rich mythology, folklore, and history of the Indian subcontinent. I am Narad Muni, the celestial storyteller and the original Time Lord. With my ability to travel through space and time, I can bring you exciting and fascinating stories from the past, the present, and the future. From the epic tales of the Mahabharata and Ramayana to the folk tales of the Panchatantra to stories of Akbar Birbal and Tenali Raman, I have a story for every occasion. The purpose of the stories is neither to pass judgment nor to indoctrinate. My goal is only to share these stories with people who may not have heard them before, and to make them more entertaining for those who have. So let's dive right in. The story begins with a vulture, an old vulture. She was not like the other vultures we have seen on the show, like Jatayu and Sampati in the Ramayana. She was just ordinary, except that she could talk. Every bird or animal featured in today's show, and indeed in most episodes on this podcast, is able to effortlessly communicate with all other birds and animals. And yet, today's vulture was slightly different in even that regard. She could communicate, but purely by sound, because she was almost completely blind. It's fitting then that we shall call her Andhi, a Hindi word that means blind. Despite being blind, in a merciless environment and surrounded by animals red in tooth and claw, Andhi survived. Not because of any special effort. Andhi was a big vulture. Her size often intimidated other animals and birds, and often that was enough to protect her from the threats that she could not see. Her survival was through sheer dumb luck. She relied on charity. The NGO Sightsavers Birds of India gave visually impaired birds like her nests to live in and frequently sent volunteers to ensure that the birds didn't go hungry. A delivery specialist, also called a dabbawala, took seeds and grains for the vegetarian birds they were helping. And for the birds of prey, like Andhi, the dabbawala would take live mice. The NGO was funded by some of the richer birds who just wanted a tax deduction. This worked really well. Until one day, when it backfired horribly. That was the day Sightsavers sent a new dabbawala on duty to feed Andhi. In retrospect, the dispatch manager admitted that a rabbit wasn't the best choice of animal to be dabbawala to the blind vulture. Andhi simply assumed that the live rabbit was a bonus along with the live mouse. Needless to say, Sightsavers evicted Andhi, even though it was perhaps their own fault. Maybe they should have kept rabbits on vegetarian bird feeding duty. Or better, simply trained both Andhi and the rabbit to prevent this unfortunate misunderstanding. Anyway, now that this happened, the consequences were pretty bad for Andhi. If the matter had gotten to real court, instead of just undergoing a media trial, she might have gotten off okay. While one faction of the press focused on labeling her as a vicious murderer who was secretly not blind at all, the other faction, which usually just took the opposite view, said that the focus was the poor bunny's family. And that angle took a long time to cover because the recently departed bunny had hundreds of children and grandchildren left behind. Andhi was constantly reminded of her crime every day in the news, both in prime time and in the braille version of her newspaper. What's more, every time she went anywhere, there were rude journalists who thrust a microphone in her face and asked her, जब आप वो बेचारे रैबिट को खा रहे थे, आपको कैसा लग रहा था? But Andhi wasn't interested in sharing her emotions. Not from that unfortunate day, and not right now, in front of all these journalists. She decided to migrate away from all this circus. She found a new place. By accident. Literally. She flew off from her home in a random direction and didn't stop flying for days. Until one day, she did stop flying. But not by choice, because she slammed straight into a tree and collapsed on the forest floor. A bunch of birds flew to her right away. "Oh, you poor thing," said one concerned parrot. "Are you okay?" asked a sparrow, asking a question that she already knew the answer to. "Here, how many feathers am I holding up?" asked a bulbul. "I don't know how many feathers you're holding up," the vulture said. "I can't see." "Oh no, call an ambulance, quickly," said a crow. "She can't see." The vulture had to clarify that it wasn't her recent accident that prevented her from seeing. She also asked for where she was to get her bearings and to make sure she was nowhere near her home forest. That should have been obvious to Andhi from the fact that no one recognized her from the tabloids and the news. The birds took pity on her, almost as if it was their fault that she had had the accident. As if their home tree had suddenly snuck into the flight path of the vulture with no prior warning. So the birds fed her, gave her water, and they made a nice little bed for her in the hollow that was at the base of the same tree. The rest of the birds lived in various branches of that tree, so they were all neighbors now. Things started to go quite well at that point for Andhi, despite her terrible beginning. She was living comfortably and there would be food and water brought to her at her doorstep. Having an extra mouth to feed meant the birds had to do a lot more work, especially when the extra mouth was as big as Andhi's. Andhi wasn't comfortable being a freeloader. She realized this and volunteered to help. But the birds felt that there were very limited things that Andhi could do. Finally, they all agreed that there was, in fact, one thing that Andhi could do. It was to mind the children. You see, all of the birds who lived on that tree had little hatchlings. They were all just a few days old. And each of them was an incredible source of joy to their parents. If Mama and Papa Bird had to stay hunting longer, Because they had to gather more food for Andhi, it meant that the babies would be by themselves for longer as well. And that meant danger. You see, the forest had all kinds of wild animals. The one the birds most feared was a wildcat. Because this wildcat, whom we'll call Jungly Billy, could easily climb trees, and her favorite food was bird sandwich. But instead of 2 slices of bread, the wildcat just used 2 other birds. That did not make the bird parents happy. Not the choice of meal their children had become, but the fact that their children did not survive that horrid wildcat. But now that Andhi was here, they were a little bit more optimistic. Everything was going to turn out fine. The birds could go and hunt, and Jungly Billy could come by and try, but the vulture was going to protect their babies. They were confident that this would work. The vulture was several times as large as the wildcat. There was no way that Jungly Billy would dare to try anything. And so, they did exactly that. Of course, they filled in Andhi on the wildcat's horrible behavior in the past and strongly cautioned the vulture against letting the wildcat appear anywhere near the nest. All Andhi had to do was to appear threatening if Jungly Billy arrived on the scene. The birds buzzed off, and Andhi continued her nap in the hollow of the tree. Jungly Billy had been watching the skies from a long distance. The moment she saw the birds take off, she made straight for the home tree. She didn't know that a new nanny lived there. Jungly Billy thought that this was going to be another free lunch. She'd pick a baby parrot here, a baby pigeon there. Maybe if she hadn't carelessly been whistling a tune, she would not have been detected. Before Jungly Billy could even make it to the base of the home tree, Andhi swooped out of the hollow. "I am the terror that flaps in the night," she said, in her best Darkwing Duck imitation voice. Andhi also didn't realize that it was daytime and not nighttime. But it still had the effect that she wanted. Jungly Billy was scared and rooted to the spot. She knew vultures, and she knew she could not outrun this giant bird. It could quickly fly and grab her in its talons if she tried to make a run for it. "Identify yourself," Andhi demanded. Billy," the wildcat stammered. Billy? Andhi repeated. "You wouldn't happen to be related to Jungly Billy? Or maybe you call her J. Billy." Jungly Billy quickly realized that her reputation had preceded her. She denied knowing anyone named Jungly Billy. She had heard of her crimes in the newspaper, of course, but that was it. Andhi relaxed her defenses and soon they began chatting. It soon became clear to the wildcat that Andhi was blind, which made her relax as well, as she set in motion her treacherous plan. Billy, as Jungly Billy called herself, claimed to be a vegetarian and a saint and a scholar. She had only come here because she had heard some very unspecific tales of Andhi's wisdom. Wouldn't Andhi please tell her a few of those stories? So Andhi obliged and went on and on about all these stories from her youth. How she had sailed across oceans, flown into the sun, caught lightning in her beak. All this while, Jungly Billy added an appropriate number of oohs and ahs. The stories went on for quite a while. Billy encouraged Andhi to continue telling the stories and not worry about her guests' hunger or thirst. You see, Billy was a vegetarian, like she said earlier. She had packed herself some very vegetarian sandwiches which had no baby birds in them whatsoever, and she would just eat from her packed lunch while Andhi continued her stories. This seemed okay to Andhi, and so she continued telling her stories till later in the evening. That's when B.B. Billy said that she had to go now, but she thanked Andhi very much for the stories. Andhi was so pleased that she had a fan that she totally did not realize that there wasn't a single tweet or chirp anymore from any of the nests. The wildcat had eaten them all. When the birds got back, what do you think they did? They only saw all of their babies gone and lots of tiny bones scattered all around Andhi, and they came to the wrong conclusion. Andhi must have eaten their children. This idea was further reinforced when the parrot, who was a little forgetful at times, suddenly remembered seeing a news report about how Andhi had eaten up a poor innocent bunny who was taking care of her. It ended on a sad note for Andhi, who was pecked to death by the very birds that had kindly hosted her, and whom she had been trying to pay back by minding their children. The moral is clearly that it's a jungle out there. There are evil people everywhere who would take advantage of you if you were to turn a blind eye. Extreme caution, bordering on the paranoid, was the way to go. Kind of like how Mad-Eye Moody was in the Harry Potter stories. That's it for this time. The Hitopadesh borrows from the Panchatantra. It's in Sanskrit as well. It was thought to be written by Narayan Pandit, a scholar from the 12th century. Both the Hitopadesh and the Panchatantra usually use animal characters to make the point. The Panchatantra is strictly speaking a chain of stories. At the conclusion of each story, one of the main characters narrates a new story, so that by the time you get to the end, you'll see that none of the Inception style stories within stories is actually complete. The Hitopadesh stories are more loosely connected. In the next episode, we'll go back to the Mahabharata. We'll continue the stories of the Pandavas and the Kauravas. We'll see their professor, Dronacharya, claiming his tuition fees not by asking for heaps of gold, but by exacting revenge on a king he held a grudge against for years. Thank you all for the comments on social media and on Spotify's Q&A. I can't directly reply to the questions there, but I'll discuss them here on the show. Arush, I will be continuing Chandrakanta soon, and doing an Akbar Birbal story as well. Thanks Rez, Hot Wheels Yedant Man, Vamsi, PKB, Juhi, Keith, and Harish for your feedback. Madhura, I'll do a story on Shivaji soon. And Vamsi, Maya Sir's story will come up soon as well. I thank you for your patience. An interesting suggestion from Harish for a story featuring ghosts. I think I have a couple of stories that might be what you're looking for. Keep an eye out for these in the near future. If you have any other comments or suggestions, or if there are any particular stories you'd like to hear, please do let me know by leaving a comment or a review on the site sfipodcast.com or tweet at SFI Podcast, or reply to the questions on Spotify's Q&A. You can also find me on Instagram and Facebook. Be sure to subscribe to the show to get notified automatically of new episodes. A big thank you to each and every one of you for your continued support and your feedback. The music is from purpleplanet.com. That's purple-planet.com. Thank you for listening, and I'll see you next time.